welcome all who've joined. This is the first of the metering training sessions that we're hosting. I'll just introduce you to the presenters. So I'm Amelia, and I'll be helping facilitate today's event, predominantly with the questions. Dave will be leading the session, so he'll be going through the agendas on the next slide, so he'll be going through that. And we've got Paul, who's our head of communications here as well, just to support on any questions that you might have. Just before we get going, I'm just going to go through some housekeeping. This session is being recorded and it will be made available on the portal probably towards the end of the week. If I could just ask that everybody, if they're not speaking or have a question, if you could just turn your cameras off and remain on mute. This just helps us save on the bandwidth. There will be opportunities throughout the session where we'll be able to do kind of questions and answers, and we'll be using Slido on those as well. So when we get to those designated sections, the QR code will come up and then you can scan that. Otherwise, if you are using the Teams as your main kind of browser, you should see an S at the top. You can click on that and you can ask questions throughout. If you don't want to use Slido for any reason, it's not working, if you just raise your hand and then you can ask a question like that. And I think then I will just hand over to Dave. This is the agenda for today, and I'll if there's no questions and everybody's in, Dave, if you're ready, we'll get going.
Yeah, thanks, Amelia, and welcome everyone. Like I said, this is like Amelia says, this is the first of 3 sessions. So the first one being gas, the second one being electric, and the third one being the REC itself and how it operates. So today I want to have a look at the gas and how gas operates, and literally give you an overview of gas, where it came from, how we got into the position that we are today, and what the next transitional steps will be going forward. So for some of you, this will be a refresher of existing knowledge. For some of you, it'll be completely new. And for me, it will be probably a reiteration of my last 39 years within the industry in both gas and electric. So I hope you all find it useful. So if you want to go on to the first slide. So the first thing I wanted to do was take you through a who's who of the industry itself, and firstly highlight the main gas distribution network operators. Now, so originally before privatisation, the whole country was under National Grid, and then when it got sectioned out, it was split up into predominantly 4 distinct areas. Now there are other smaller organisations which we'll come on to and have a look at in a bit. So predominantly in the far north and the far south, you've got Scotia Gas Networks. Through the north, through Yorkshire and Cumbria, you've Northern Gas Networks, NGN. And then through the central region, you've got Cadent, and then out to the left, you've got Wales and West Utilities. So even though they are all independent organisations, they all independently reporting to their own boards, they are all still governed under the same rules and the same legislation all the way through the UK. Now, if you notice, I haven't included Ireland in this, and there is a specific reason for that. Ireland is under its own governance, it's under a separate organisational structure. So for the purposes of today and what we're going to be talking about with the REC, Ireland is excluded. So if you want to move on, Millie, please. So how it all works. So if we think about how we actually get our gas and where the gas actually comes from, we've predominantly 2 routes in. One being a producer and the other being an importer. And you'll probably all been aware that over the last few weeks and few months, in effect, with the situation in Ukraine, that there's been a lot of challenges to the gas networks. One of the advantages that we've got as the UK is we don't import, or we didn't used to import, much of our gas from Russia. It was in the low percentages, which we'll come on to later. So, in effect, whichever it is, a producer or an importer, it will always come in to a terminal. Now, whether that's a production terminal or what we call an LNG, so liquid natural gas terminal, it'll come in at those points. So the gas producers and the importers, they're responsible for selling gas to the licensed gas shippers. Now, shipper owns the gas as it travels through the network and the transmission and distribution lines. So in effect, what happens is the shipper will buy the gas from the producer or the importer. So once it comes in, they own the gas until it's sold on again. So basically, shipping involves buying gas from a producer and then arranging it to be conveyed to the supply points through the national transmission system and selling it to the gas suppliers. So even though the shippers don't actually own any pipes, they don't own any network. Now, they may be linked to an organisation, but they don't officially own anything. No, the only thing that they own is the gas, and they are a retailer in effect. They'll buy it from the importer and they'll sell it onto a gas company, and that's their role. So, moving on from shippers, the shippers also pay National Grid. Now National Grid are the organisation, so you can see all the pink pipelines that are on there. They're the high pressure pipelines throughout the UK. And what happens with those is the National Grid are responsible for running those, and the shipper actually pays for the gas to be distributed from those right through to the distribution network operator and onto the suppliers. And they're also responsible for the LNG importers to pay the right to land at the import terminal. So if they've bought it from external, they have to pay for it to be landed on site. What will also happen then is gas consumers, homes and businesses throughout the UK, have many gas companies, supply companies to choose from. So over the years, we'd be potentially the one with British Gas, and that was the only one you can organise it from. So from now, or since 1998, as the market started to open up, organisations could then purchase from all sorts of other customers and different organisations, and they then had to pay the supply companies. Now, the interesting thing being with this is there's only one organisation that actually collects the money from the customer, and that's the supplier. So the supplier is then responsible for paying the local distribution network operator for the passing the pipes through the pipelines, and their part of the standing charge covers that, and the maintenance of the pipes and everything else. They're also responsible for buying the gas from the shipper. So you can see that the money go around, all the monies that work throughout the whole of the organisation work through the supplier. Now, what will happen with the gas and distribution network operators for them to manage their network and to work? They are now just going through the process. Well, they're now in what they call RIIO-GD2, which is their second gas distribution review period, where basically they have to identify all their running costs, operational costs, and apply to Ofgem for how much money it's going to take to run their business. Once they've applied for that, then there are rules applied by Ofgem to have a look at what the profitability is, how much they're charging customers, how much their standing charges are, and operational costs. And basically, they will then come back and state, right, okay, you can have X or Y amount. You have to make that work. And you're only allowed to make so much profit from certain activities. And you've still got to manage the whole of the emergency service. So if you think for the network operators, they also manage the whole, the gas distribution network operators also manage the emergency service for the whole of the UK. Now, the biggest area of that is Cadent. Cadent still run and manage the gas centre and transmit out to all the other organisations. So if there's ever a gas leak, one of the things that the HSE were very, very stringent on was the fact that they had to make it easy for customers to report a gas leak. And it's always been the same number, and it's an 0800 number, 111 999. And if you talk to any gas operatives, that will be drilled into their minds as to where it is. You will see it registered on every meter, every website, all across the land. You can also see on that slide there is another team mentioned of IGTs. So these are independent gas transporters. So when we talk about the main gas transporters throughout the whole of the UK, there are some smaller ones. So we've talked about your SGNs, so your Scotia Gas Networks, Northern Gas Networks, Cadent and Wales and West. In between those, there are also some independent ones. And the independent ones, the way that they operate is basically, it could have been a housing association that's bought a massive plot of land or an area of development, and the gas distribution network operator will take the supply point to a certain position in the field, and then an independent gas transporter may then take the pipeline over at that point to the housing. So they'll run all the network into the housing around the estate, and they become independent. They again are still managed under the same rules, regulations and everything else that everybody else is managed under. Okay. Next slide, please. I feel like Chris Whitty. All right, so just a little bit of information about gas transporters then. So if you look at producers and importers, so there are only 8 gas terminals in the UK where gas can be imported into. Now, the interesting thing that you will find, excuse me, with gas is natural gas has no smell to it. That smell is actually an injected, generated smell, and it's generated at source and then pumped into the lines at certain points. And the whole reason for doing that is the whole of the gas network is designed so that if there is a leak or any damage to it, anybody should be able to tell that there is an issue. And that's because it's such a recognisable smell that people know what it is instantly. And I'm going back to my chemical days here, but it's actually a substance called diethyl sulfide butyl mercaptan that they inject into it that gives it that distinct smell. Now, the one thing that you can happen with this stuff, and people that work in the gas industry regular, you can become blind to it. You can become nose blind to it. So you get that used to the smell that you don't recognise it all the time. And that's why all gas operatives carry either gas sniffers or leak detection fluid or certain detectors to enable them to identify if there is a presence. And I mentioned earlier that we, even how we get our gas. So 50% of our gas comes from the North Sea. So we are fairly self-sufficient with it, but there is still quite a bit imported. 33 of it comes from Norway, 33%, and the rest is made up from liquid natural gas imports from Qatar and the US, with a minimal amount from the US from Russia. At the last count, it was less than 1% coming from Russia. Now, with all the changes and the issues with Ukraine, that's down to literally zero now. So we don't have the same challenges that the rest of Europe have. Whereas if you think of Germany and some of those other places, over 60 and 70% of their gas is imported or was imported through Russia. So national grid, so we talked about the national grid, and I showed you the pink lines that were there. So they operate the high pressure gas network before transferring ownership to the independent gas transporters and gas distribution network operators. That network consists of approximately 7,660 kilometres of pipeline, so 476 miles, 4,760 miles of pipeline throughout the UK, much of which is buried. So there are a lot of it there are some areas where it's overground and everything else, but much of that pipeline is buried. So you can imagine the work and the size of these things that are having to transmit the volumes of gas. And then you've got your gas distribution network operators, or your independent gas transporters. So between them, they serve around 23.1 million customers. There are many customers still within the UK that are not connected to a gas network. Especially if you get into some of the Highlands in Scotland and everything else, some of the more remote regions of the UK are still not on gas. So they can be, their heating systems can be oil in a lot of cases, which again, oil's not covered within the REC. It's outside the REC and how that works. They're responsible for the maintenance and repair of 170,877 miles of pipework. So if you think about where they are, that's split up against your Cadence, your Scotia Gas networks, and your independents and everybody else. And there are only 4 GDNOs that cover the whole country, which were managed. And there are currently 15 independent gas transporters registered within the UK. And again, like I mentioned, excluding Northern Ireland. So there are 15 pockets of organisations that are interspersed within each of the networks. And then when you look at suppliers, and I'll come on to meter operators and things like that separately later on, but if you go on the Ofgem website, there is a huge raft of suppliers listed. You'll see over 200 named. Out of that, there are only 37 active registered suppliers. And the reason that there is the discrepancy is a lot of organisations registered names but never became active. So they thought they were going to split off, or they were going to do certain offers, they were going to do certain deals under certain names. So there are some names on there that you will potentially recognise that are with companies, but they're not actually actively operating. And the big thing is, over the last 12 months, you've around about 70 suppliers have ceased trading. And that's either they've been bought up or merged into other organisations, or in some ways just ceased trading, gone bust. And that's quite a large number. So at one point, you were seeing, as we were looking at the Ofgem websites and things like that, you were seeing those go down literally weekly, 2 to 3 and 4 a week. Now, the interesting thing with those things is happening is what happens to all those customers. And that goes under what they call a supplier of last resort process. You'll hear it called SOLR, SOLR. And basically, organisations can bid, in effect, to take those customers on, but you're also taking the debt and all the associated risks that come with that as well. And in certain circumstances, organisations may be appointed as a supplier of last resort because it's easier. So there's a few challenges relating to that. Right, next one, please. Okay. So we talked about the organisations involved with actually getting the gas backwards and forwards and around the system. What we've not looked at is, so what does that mean, and who else is involved? So some of the names that are on here, you'll see will disappear because they've been taken over. So if we start with Ofgem, Ofgem for gas wasn't originally called that; it was called Ofgas, and it started in 1990 with the supply of electricity and gas retail customers in the UK being unbundled from the rest of the industry. At the time of privatisation, British Gas and the regional public electricity suppliers held the monopoly. So basically, you couldn't go anywhere else. If you lived in London, you were tied to London. If you lived in Yorkshire, you were tied to Yorkshire. Northern, you were tied to Neeb. And in gas, you had no choice. You were tied to British Gas. That was the only place that you could go. And what they recognised, so if you think about what's happening with the REC of the merging of the two fuels, The REC's not the first place to do this. This was done with Ofgem all those years ago in 1990s, where basically they said, well, actually, it seems silly to manage a combined utility when we've separated it all out and it's all managed under one central office, to have two monopolies commissions or two overseeing commissions. So what they said is, well, actually, what we'll do is we'll take Offa, which was the Office for Electricity Regulation, and Ofgas, and we'll merge them into Ofgem. So from that point, from 1996 in effect through to 1999, as that transition happened, company individuals could start to choose who their gas and electricity came from. So Ofgas was no more, and Ofgem took over. You'll see on the bottom left-hand side the Joint Office of Gas Transporters. So this is these are the code administrator for the Uniform Network Code, so what's known in the industry as the UNC. So these set out common transportation arrangements for Great British gas industry. And there's roles to administer the governance of the process for modifying the UNC. And there are a number of subcommittees that oversee that operation. That still exists and will continue to exist. It's not come under the REC. So because it's on the distribution side, it stayed out there. The big one, so you see SPA's listed twice. You've got SPA and you've got SPA Executive Committee. So if we take the SPA, so these were the supply point administration agreement company, and their role was basically was to be like an operational arrangements between the gas suppliers and transporters. So these were like sat between the two. And they were designed as a multi-party agreement to which all domestic gas suppliers and all gas transporters were required to become a licensee to. You had absolutely no choice. If you were going to work in the industry as a supplier or a gas distribution network operator, you had to accede to the SPA. And basically, they became the discussion and the governance type activity, covering the processes which were not covered in existing contracts or arrangements, but nonetheless considered important and effective to the effective transfer of customers between suppliers and all sorts of other stuff. And the agreement provided a robust mechanism for making changes to operational agreements. So things like the RGMA sat under there, the retail gas metering arrangements. So how we transmitted data from one party to another, and how that was transmitted, where it was transmitted, and the timescales that it was transmitted within. Which was that all worked fine, and that has now changed, and which we'll come on to in a bit. The SPA Executive Committee. This was an overseeing committee, and again was made up of gas distribution network operators, suppliers, and they were literally the governance type activity to provide governance committees for two of the other things that you'll see in there, the MAMCOP and the AMICOP. Now, the AMICOP and the MAMCOP are codes of practice, and we'll come back into those later on, along with the ASCOP. So, the next one you got, the big one at the top, ExaServe. So we talked about the transmission of data backwards and forwards by the SPA. So the SPA set out the rules for communication, but in effect, the communication provider, the CSDP, so the central data service provider was ExaServe, and they provided all the vital services for gas suppliers, shippers, and transporters. And they centrally register and hold all the details of all the gas supply points. So for every MPAN that's on the system has to be held within ExaServe. And that allowed the gas industry to go in and communicate and hold a central register of everything. What meter was on site, what pressure was there, service tiers, meter changes, meter readings. So the whole lot was in there. Now, the interesting thing being is Exaserve in effect took that data over from what was the National Grid and British Gas. So, and they had a different philosophy on holding and transmitting information. So some data was there, some data wasn't there, and pulling it in from all sorts of different systems has been a huge ongoing job. So every so often, they used to speak to the meter operators and the suppliers and everybody else and do what they called a data cleanse, where they just literally ask them, what data have you got in your system, and we'll do a reconciliation against what we've got in ours, and therefore try and do an alignment piece. And over the years, that data has got tighter and tighter and tighter and closer. And the other advantage now with the implementation of smart metering, for every domestic meter over the next few years should at some point have been changed, and therefore a full data set should be held. Now, the other thing that helps is the fact that these are remote communications now, those can be updated quicker and a lot faster. Now, it's interesting when you start to talk about, when we talked about SPA and they did all the data agreements and everything else, and the review of gas metering arrangements. Data in the gas industry wasn't and potentially still isn't like that of the electricity industry. So the gas industry, in effect, if we wanted to go back to original days, you could still quite legally, if you wanted, communicate by carrier pigeon if you could get one to work. In effect, the only thing that the RGMA stated and that the MAMCOP and the AMICOP stated was that you had to comply with the format, which basically says that anything that you send to Exaserve or you send to other parties has to be in a certain format and has to contain certain data. What it didn't stipulate was that it had to be transmitted by a certain way. So for some organisations, the big industry type activities, your Cadence, your NGNs and everybody else was still using what they call the IX link, which was the original system. A lot of other companies then went on to the data transfer catalogue and the data transfer network run by Electrolink, and that then put the flows electronic, which made the control and the passing of flows much easier, and the reporting. And that's where Electrolink basically came in. They were responsible for reporting and holding the data transfer network, in effect of transferring electronic data between all registered parties. But unfortunately, not all data went through there. The other one that you've got in there, so BSI, so the British Standards Institute, the kite mark, it's probably something that everybody's familiar with. With the kite mark and the British standards, their role within the industry basically is that anybody who produces any equipment or any, including metering, pipework, fittings, soldering, tools and everything else, it must comply with the British standards. So for argument's sake, even something down to as daft as a washer, so a rubber washer that goes into a gas fitting has its own standard under BS 746. And same with the pipe works and fittings are under BS 746. They also look after some of the metering arrangements. So there are 3 specific codes that are, 2 specific BS 6400s, Part 1 and Part 2, that deal with metering arrangements for domestic meters, medium and low pressure. So again, the British standards are there to set the professional standards that everybody has to achieve and has to buy their equipment to enable it to be fitted on the network. If it doesn't fit or meet with those or the European standards, it's not allowed to go on to or it's not allowed to be adopted into the system and used. So the one in the middle, IGEM, so Institute of Gas Energy Managers. These are a professional body, and you'll probably hear IGEM reference And they're basically there to support individuals and organisations connected with the gas industry. They look at excellence and core aims to help all those involved within gas achieve a minimum standard and maintain the highest standards of professional competence. So for every organisation that is what used to be called a MAM under the MAM COP, you had to have an IGM registered engineer of a certain level of competence on your books or available to you to assess what you were doing and how it worked. So if you were doing design, you had to have somebody who had the relevant skills and experience to be able to do that and the relevant IGM qualifications. IGM used to host a lot of the MAMCOP meetings, which at the time they were attended by, on average, over 50 different organisations, from approved meter installers to MAMs to suppliers to distribution network operators. So some of that now has moved over into the operational meetings. There has now been a gas operational meeting set up once a quarter to look at some of the issues that were discussed at what was the MAMCOP board. The HSE, so everybody's well aware of the HSE, so the Health and Safety Executive. There are many rules and regulations that are sat under the HSE that are there for compliance across the whole of the organisation, from your office all the way through to the engineers that are out in the field, through to operating in gas services and gas stations and everything else. Anything that is done is always assessed by the HSE, and when it comes down to it, potentially they are always the last ones that jump all over you if anything goes wrong, and they're the ones that you ultimately end up answering to. So the last three that you've got on there: MAMCOP, ASCOP, and AMICOP. So the MAMCOP, you'll see later on that this terminology has changed. It used to stand for Meter Asset Management Code of Practice. And basically it was facilitated by the SPA, and they managed both the audit process and the document itself. And as I said, it was attended by MAMs and GDNOs and IGTs. But basically the whole idea of it was to get the relevant industry bodies around the table and discuss issues and look at best practice and improvements and challenges to drive the industry in a positive direction. Again, like I say, it was well attended, and they managed the audit process, which basically for MAMCOP was a 3-year audit spread over 3 years. So in effect, if you were starting out, your year 1 audit was a full audit across the whole of the MAMCOP. So that was your back office functions and your field activities. So they would do an assessment of all your documentation, all your working practices, your management techniques and everything else, and the assessment of individuals actually fitting a meter and through the reverse logistics program back out to a meter being passed back to its original owner. So that was managed separately through there, and then all the results were fed into the MAMCOP. So every organisation knew where they were. Now, like I said, that was a 3-year, but what would happen is, first year would be a full audit end to end. Year 2 would be what they classed as a surveillance audit, so they will pick random aspects of it and do an overview. And especially if there'd been issues within the industry or issues within activities or things that had been potentially highlighted in previous audits that could have been better, they would review those. And then year 3 again was another surveillance visit along the similar sort of lines, and then it re-kicked in again at year 1, and you started with a full audit again. The AMICOP, this was an interesting one. So AMICOP and MAMCOP actually ran side by side. These were originally called Awamis. So they were originally Ofgem approved meter installers. So it was normally the Awami COP. So the Ofgem approved meter installer code of practice. Ofgem relinquished their hold on that, and it moved under SPA and became the AMI. So it just became the approved meter installer code of practice. Again, it fell under the same auspice as the MAMCOP. Now, if you were doing your MAMCOP audit, many of the things that sat in your AMI audit were exactly the same. So some of the things were covered off in both audits. So you could end up having a dual audit in effect. And that's one of the things that we'll come on to later on in some of the changes that the REC is looking at. Now, the one thing is you could be a MAM and an AMI, or you could be an AMI only, or you could be a MAM only. Now, the reason that they did that is that if you are a meter asset manager, you are responsible for the transmission of all the data and everything else. So you have to have big systems, you have to have all the network capabilities and everything to transmit. Oh, excuse me. Whereas if you are an AMI, you don't need that. As an AMI, you only need to be able to talk to your MAM. Oh, excuse me. So what a meter asset management could do is just employ people to operate the systems and then subcontract to a meter operator business, in effect, to an AMI to go fit all their metering for them. Or they could actually subcontract it out to somebody who was just gas safe registered. And I'll talk about gas safe registered in a minute. But basically, if they were an AMI, then it was deemed standard and everything else, and you were then compliant. If they weren't an AMI and you did a gas metering system, under the legislation, the MAM had to, within 30 days, go out and inspect that metering job. Otherwise, it instantly became non-compliant. So there were massive advantages to using AMI organisations. Otherwise, you were literally doing the work twice. You'd get somebody else to go and do the work, and then you'd have to go and inspect it. ASCOP. So the ASCOP was the Automated Meter Reading Service Provider Code of Practice. Now this one, it was one of the interesting ones. So the MAMCOP and the AMI COP are compulsory. They are mandatory codes. You have to abide by them. The ASCOP was a voluntary code of practice for those using automated meeting reading devices, and it related to the non-domestic market only. So basically, these are a unit that actually just clips onto a meter, but it has to be clipped on in a certain way. It has to meet certain regulations. But in effect, it was a non-mandatory obligation. Okay, next one, Amy, please. Okay. So, how does that all sit together? So, in effect, what you've got is either your gas wells or wherever you're drilling for, so the producer will actually go along and do all the drilling or the import in certain activities to get it into one of these 8 onshore plants. At that point, it's stored. Now, it's one of the massive advantages you've got over gas that gas has got over electricity is the fact that you can store it. Now, one of the interesting things that you'll probably note as we move further along, for a lot of you, you will have found that there used to be big, what they call gas holding stations around the place. So these were like a massive container that literally rose up and down, and the reason it rose up and down was basically to keep the pressure on the gas. You'll notice that those are now disappearing. So there has been a project going on throughout all the organisations to get rid of these things. And the reason that they don't use them anymore is that instead of storing the gas in these big massive cylinders, they actually store they store it in the pipeworks now, and it's called line packing. So basically they increase the pressure in certain parts in the system to hold more gas. So instead of having these big ugly containers on the surface, on the edge of towns and cities and everything else, they've now got rid of that. It's now stored in the pipework underground. So there's big advantages to doing that. It's safer to do that, and it's cheaper to do that. So, so in effect, your gas comes in, it goes into your gas processing plant, where any of the harmful products are removed or they need to get them, and at the same time, it's then compressed and goes into your main lines. Once that's compressed and sent around the state, around the odorant, so that that smell that you all get used to is added as part of the transmission, and then it hands over into the distribution network. So your local GDNOs off to your gas, your big gas consumers, your power stations. Power stations now are using with many gas CHP power stations using huge amounts of gas. There is always the challenge around, gas in industry and everything else. It's probably one of the easiest forms of creating heat for the use in big industry, glass industry, fires, furnaces, and things like that. So as we move potentially to towards greener things, this is one of the challenges that are now finding is how do you use those things in those industries. If we move away from gas, and that's why they're looking at hydrogen and other fuels to be able to do that. And then into your local homes and your local organisations as to where that goes in the future. Amelia, if we move on to the next one, please.
So this is just an opportunity if anybody wanted to have any questions for Dave on what he's just gone through. You can either scan this via your smartphone, the QR code, and it should come up, or you can just go old school and type slido.com into a browser and just type that number in if you have any questions. Otherwise, happy for you to raise your hands and we can go through them verbally. Once you've got on this, you can ask questions throughout the session as well. We do have further Q&As dotted in the presentation, but I'll give you a couple of minutes just in case, just to get people logged on, just to see if there are any questions. Conscious I can't see. Paul, are there any hands raised?
No hands raised at the moment, Millie. Keeping my eyes on it for you. There's a question just come in on
Yep.
Slido on the screen.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Okay, so the first question for you, Dave, does the shipper own the gas throughout the whole supply chain?
In effect, they own it until it gets to the consumer. So they don't own it until it comes out of the production station. So it's that point between the two parties. So if you think for the gas distribution network operator, they never actually own the gas. The shipper owns it all the way through. The only thing that you're paying for, in effect, and this is one of the things you stand in charge, is you're paying a line rental. You're paying for somebody to provide a pipe for you to ship the gas through, and unfortunately, the person that ends up covering the cost for that, as always, with everything, is the consumer.
Thank you.
It's a good question, because it is one that people think that the supplier owns the gas, and they don't until they actually have a customer to sell it to. So it does cause some challenges.
Perfect, thank you. Any other questions? I'm sure, Paul, is there any questions that
Nothing on Teams for now, Millie.
Okay, perfect. All right, as I've said, so if nothing comes in the next couple of seconds, we'll move on. But as I've said, you can ask questions on Slido. You don't have to do them through the designated Q&A. That link will constantly be working. So if something comes up on a slide, then we can explore it then. Dave, you ready to move on?
Yep, let's go for it.
Okie dokie.
Okay, if I can go straight on to the next one. So one of the things I said that we'd start to look at would be the role of a meter operator, or a MAM in this case, so a meter asset manager. And for most people, when they talk about metering systems, they think about the domestic metering system. Now, I know I've seen a few names that are from larger organisations on the sidebar that will potentially recognise some of these installations. In realistic terms, we only think about the small domestic one that's in our house. In reality, some of these meters are absolutely enormous, and I'll give you an example. So this is what we would class as a small rig. So the metering component to it isn't that big. It's not huge, but the ancillary pipework and the volume of gas going through it and how it records is huge. So you've got all sorts of valves on there. You've got meter outlet valves. You've got a similar sort of system to what you have at home. The only difference being with these things is that what can happen is these could be, for argument's sake, a large gas user that cannot allow for the gas to go off. And if you wanted to change the meter, you'd actually have to turn the gas off. So in a lot of cases, they have what they call a bypass on it, which basically means that you can change the meter, divert the gas another way, change the meter, and then put the gas back on, so you never actually interrupt the supply for the customer. Now we have a similar sort of setup in electricity. So for large gas users, that is a big advantage. You imagine it's a massive glass blowing furnace or anything like that. The last thing they want you to do is to turn it off. You know how long it takes for your central heating system to come back up to temperature. So you can imagine what it's going to do to one of those places. Just to give you an example of how big these can be. So the Shard in London, when they built the Shard, they actually built the meter. They started to build the meter and then built the meter housing around it. So the building itself is actually built over the gas meter. The only way that is coming out is in bits. It will not come out in one piece. So you can imagine the size of that piece of equipment. For some of these meters, where you'll get a meter asset manager, so a MAM currently, bringing a meter to your house, and he tucks it under his arm and puts it in there. These will come on a low loader, and it will come on 2 or 3 of those things to build it up. So for it to be coupled up, and it's then craned into position. You're not carrying this under your arm. So it's there is a bit of a difference. So that's potentially just an example of a larger installation. If you go on to the next slide, Amelia, this is potentially what you're more used to seeing. And I'm going to use some terminology that you'll probably hear within the gas industry that you may not be aware of. So you'll see on the bottom left-hand side of that, on the bottom left of that left-hand meter, you'll see it says upstream. So whenever we're talking anything upstream of that valve, so what we call the ECV, the emergency control valve, that will belong to the distribution network, so the gas distribution network operator, up to the point where it goes into the national transmission grid. The flexible pipe that then goes up to what we call the meter regulator or governor is basically, the whole idea of that is so that we can actually transform the pressure down, in effect. So it'll come in on the street at round about 75 millibar. But in your house, it's only between 19 and 21 millibar. And that's the whole idea of that little governor that sits on top of the left-hand side of the meter. It steps that pressure down to a more usable activity in your house. Otherwise, you'll switch your cooker on and burn your kitchen ceiling if we don't regulate it down. The meter, the one that's shown there, is an old U6 type. There are all sorts of different versions now. The electronic ones are a lot smaller, so they're E6 or U6. So the letter in effect, if you think of it, a U6 means ultrasonic, so it actually doesn't measure the volume of gas. It's the sound of the gas going through the pipework. It's how those measured. The old type that this one is, potentially a G6, was measured by bellows. So as the gas went through, it pumped a set of bellows, and that made the dials tick round. And then the other version, the E6, surprisingly not, is an electronic. The 6 actually stands for cubic, for the number of cubic meters that it will let pass through. So along 6 cubic meters. So that's where the letters and the numbers come from. And then you've got the outlet pipe. Now, the interesting thing being is that outlet pipe is the responsibility of the customer. It belongs to the customer. So anything downstream is then classed as downstream. So you've got upstream of the meter and downstream of the meter is how you identify the components. So before the ECV belongs to the distribution network operator. From the top side of the ECV to the right-hand side of the meter belongs to the supplier stroke meter asset manager, or AMI, and the orange bit that you see going out belongs to the customer. So you can see where the demarcations are on those. The right-hand side, excuse me, is a slightly different version, still from a domestic, well, potentially a domestic property, but this is what we call a medium pressure setup. Now, medium pressure can happen in areas where what happens was, so for argument's sake, the national grid or the national distributions and the GDNOs will have 3 sets of pipes. You either have high pressure, intermediate, sorry, there's more. So you have high pressure, so your standard pressures, you have intermediate pressure, medium pressure, and low pressure. And what happens is, as you get closer and closer to where you need it, and what you step the voltage down through compressors, the gas down through compressor stations, and you change the volume of the gas in the pipe, and therefore the pressure at the meter. Now, what happens is you may be in a large rural area where actually it's pointless stepping it down to low pressure because you need the volume of gas to go off somewhere else. So you may take a customer off a medium pressure supply point. But what that means is, because we haven't decreased it down to the 19 to 21 millibar at that point, it'll be coming in much higher to the customer. So we have to put a different type regulator on it, and these are what they call a 2-stage regulator. You'll notice that the colour of the handle on the emergency control valve is different, so that enables our operatives to identify or potentially identify that it's a medium pressure rig because it's got an orange stroke red handle on it. There will also be a little disc in there that will say it's medium pressure. But what happens is, in that, you've 2 parts to this. You've got the regulator itself, which will downgrade the pressure down to the right pressure, again down to 19 to 21, so it's still using the same pressure. But you've also got on this what they call a slam shut. And the slam shut is designed if the regulator fails or something happens and the pressure at the meter point is too high, the valve automatically closes. And it's what they call a slam shut valve. Now, what happens is with these is there are 5 and 10 yearly inspections that MAMs, so meter asset managers, are responsible for, and they have to go out and look at these. So 5 years is a visual inspection, just make sure everything looks okay and just quick test on it. The 10-year is literally a slam shut test, check, strip down, and make sure that the burner pressures and everything else. So for a 5-yearly visual inspection, they'll still have to go inside and do an inspection of the flame and make sure it's burning correctly and the working pressure. For the 10-year, it's a test on the slam shut and that the regulator is still working properly. So they have to then repeat that process. But it just gives you a differentiation between the two and what the two are in effect there for and what they want to do. So if you were an Amy, you could work on either of these, but it depends on your level of skill as well. So if you've got your base level skills, you can work on the left-hand one. If you're going up and you're medium pressure authorized, you can work on the left one and the right-hand one. So it depends on what you're actually doing as to what you can do and where you can go with this. Again, when they go out and do the audits and everything else, that's what they're checking for. They're checking for that you know the legislation, the regulations, the safe working practices, and that you record everything and that everything's set properly. Now, the biggest one that's slightly different in a commercial property, you can have a domestic meter in a commercial property, but it could be feeding a domestic property. So if you imagine a flat above a shop, so downstairs is a shop and it's got 2 meters in it, 2 gas meters, but one of them is for the house upstairs. When you're working on it, because it's now in a commercial environment, there is another regulation that applies under the Health and Safety at Work, under the Health and Safety Executive, and that's the Dangerous Substances and Explosives Atmosphere Regulations, DSEA, and therefore you have to conduct additional checks to actually do that. Those regulations can also apply in flats, so if there's more than 3 meters in a flat, or they're on a branch manifold. So there's lots of legislation and regulation that they've got to be aware of. But again, that stuff does not fall under the rec. It falls outside the rec, but operatives have to be aware of it. Okay, next one, Amelia, please.
Dave, just oh well, there we go. We're straight on to the questions now. I was just about to answer the top one, and just to confirm with everyone, there was a lot of detail on that last slide. But as we circulate the recording, the video recording on our YouTube channel by the end of the week, we'll also be doing the same with the slides. So don't worry too much about copying down all that information. We'll make sure that's shared accordingly.
Okay, do you want me to go through the questions, Paul?
Makes a lot of sense to me.
Yep. Okay. So I suppose you've answered the first one, that the slides will be available. So they're absolutely right. When we come on to what's changed under the rec, a MAM is actually now known as a MEM. So they have now changed the terminology from a meter asset manager to a meter equipment manager. So yes, we'll come on to that next. Is there another way a shipper supplier can identify a pressure medium site other than lacking at the ICB? Yes, there is. So there's various ways that you can do it. You can tell by looking at the regulator, if it's a 2-stage regulator. You can actually do what they call a let me get this the right way around. I think it's a GD1. So you can actually write to the network owner. So for argument's sake, if you were in Northern Gas Networks area, you can actually provide them with the MPAN, so the MPRN, and ask them to tell you the pressure tier on site. Now, in some circumstances, what they won't be able to tell you 100%. What they'll be able to tell you is that there are medium pressure networks within the area, and that it may be likely because they can't see any low pressure ones. Exoserve also holds some of the information, and there is now a discussion under some of the codes and everything else. If so, under the retail gas metering arrangements data transfer network, the ruling basically is now, if you know the pressure, you have to put it on the flow. If you've been made aware of it, then it has to now go on the flow. You have to transmit it. If you've not been made aware of it, but you've identified it as you've gone, then you have to put it on the flow. If you don't know either way, then it stays blank. But unfortunately, I think Exoserve were trying. There is, and you tested Mike's about 7 years ago, is this when we discussed this? There is a spreadsheet on Exoserve that you can apply to look at, and I think it was under customer life cycle at exaserve.com. Paul, if you look on the AMO notes, if you can check that at some point, and if we can get it out to people. But basically, what happened was a certain organisation started to build a spreadsheet of known medium pressure sites, and you could apply and have a look on that sheet. So that may be helpful to people. Who owns the meter? Interesting question. A customer can own their own meter, so a customer can buy their meter. It is unusual, but a lot of the universities and a lot of hospitals and places like that did decide to buy their own meter. The unfortunate thing with buying your own meter, so even a domestic customer can buy their own meter, there are certain regulations and obligations that apply to you, and you get classed as the Gas Act owner, which means that you are responsible for the maintenance, accuracy, and everything else of the meter. So that's an interesting one. In reality, for most meters are rented, and they are rented by the supplier from a metering organisation and installed. So in effect, for the meter that's on site, the supplier will collect a standing charge for it. Some of that's for the maintenance, the running and the operation. Some of it that helps pay for the distribution network operators, and some of it goes towards to pay for the meter itself. Both meters need to be checked every 5 years. So for medium pressure meters, so anything that's on medium pressure, by law there is a 5 and 10 yearly inspection. There are in effect metering. So there was a license condition called license condition 12, which was relinquished about 5 or 6 years ago, which put an obligation on suppliers and meter operator on suppliers in effect to visually inspect their metering and metering equipment every 24 months, 3 years, between 24 months and 3 years. In effect, that was taken off. They removed that with the introduction of smart and the fact that they knew that most organisations were going to be going in and changing them, and that meter reading was becoming a less and less activity because they will be done remotely. The other advantage being is with the data that they could get off smart meters, that they should know quicker that there was an issue on site. So they did remove some of those obligations. However, not all organisations stopped doing those checks. But when it comes to checks for that type of activity, that's a legal obligation, is the 5 years. Multiple meter manufacturers in the gas world, yes. Is the short answer. There are hundreds. Now, the interesting thing being is not all of them are approved for use in the UK, and that there is a data set held which holds all the gas meters that are approved. So you cannot just go to China and buy a gas meter and bring it here and fit it, because it potentially wouldn't comply with the standards. Some of the standards sit with the British Standards Institute, some of them sit with the gas industry itself, some of them sit with the HSE, and there are multiple pieces of legislation. One piece of legislation that you potentially need to be aware of is things like the Measurements Instruments Directive, which we'll come on to in a bit. But in effect, the Measurements Instruments Directive is owned by BEIS. BEIS have, so the business, and well, God, I can never remember what they call themselves. They keep changing the name. It used to be DTI, it's the Department of Trade and Industry. But BEIS basically, they have a part of their organisation called OPPS, which is the Office of Product Standards. And basically what happens is any meter that's used in the UK has to meet the Measurements Instruments Directive for accuracy. And there are legal obligations again then that says a gas meter has to be proved to be accurate every so often. So every 3 years, a gas meter, a random sample of gas meters is taken off the wall, tested and checked to prove that it's still compliant with that. So yeah, there are hundreds, but you have to be careful where you buy them from, and that they meet the current and relevant legislation.
Thanks, Dave. Paul, are there any questions? Has anybody raised their hand?
Nope, no hands up on Teams as far as I can see.
Okay, perfect. As I've said before, obviously we've got another Q&A bit, I think, coming up. So if you have any questions, you can still use the QR code. So Dave, you okay to move on?
Yep, not a problem.
Okie dokie, off we go.
Okay, so as one of the people asked the question, you're absolutely right. There are a number of changes that happened when things moved under the REC. So originally, when the REC was conceived and what they were looking at actually doing, in effect, for a lot of the stuff, it was originally in the short term a lift and shift. So basically, a lot of the original documentation and a lot of the original thought processes and how it would operate and everything were just moved under a new banner. However, in the interim, some work had started under SPA with the MAMCOP and the AMICOP to consolidate that document. So, and the reason for that is there was a lot of crossover between what a meter asset manager did and what an approved meter installer did. And it was a little bit difficult to have two documents that actually, if you altered one, you had to go in and alter the other to make sure that the two remained aligned. So that work had already started, and then it continued as it was brought over and completed into the REC. At the same time, so the MAMCOP and the AMICOP in effect disappeared, and they became the MCOP, so the metering code of practice. But at the same time, because work REC was looking at, so what happens when we bring the electricity codes over, and the whole idea of this was to bring everything under one retail energy code and treat energy as a fuel on its own. The thought process then said, well, actually, what is the difference between a meter asset manager in electric? So they were called a MOP in electric, so a meter operator, and a MAM in gas. And actually, is the philosophy very, very similar? And therefore, are we confusing ourselves? And therefore, the terminology now became a MEM, so a meter equipment manager. So it doesn't actually matter whether you're talking gas or electric when you're talking about a MEM, but it does make a difference depending on what code it relates to. So the principle is the same, it's just the code that's different. However, the AMICOP, there isn't an equivalent in electricity as an approved meter installer. You were either a MOP or not a MOP, and there was no distinction of anything else. So the AMI term still remains, so they haven't changed that. The only difference being now, though, is that the AMI is actually sat in the same document as the MEM under the MCOP, so they've actually kept that. SPA, so the SPA and the SPA Executive Committee and their roles. So the SPA was in effect responsible for the discussion groups and everything else, and it was responsible for literally the auditing process. So in effect, it's been split a little bit across those two REC panels now. So you've got a REC metering expert panel and the REC performance assurance board. So the executive committee in effect looked after the governance type activity, and that's now been spread across all the REC panels depending upon where it is. So some of them will go into the REC change panel, some of it will be sat in the metering expert panel, and some of it will be sat in the performance assurance board. However, it's clear to say that anything that sits under auditing now clearly sits with the REC performance assurance board. And that's one of the things that was never in SPA or SPA Executive Committee was in effect a dedicated board which looked at the performance and challenges of industry. Now, for anybody who's well versed in in electric, sorry, if you ever heard as a supplier or anything else that you were being taken to the PAB, so the Election Performance Assurance Board, that was never a good thing. And I would suggest potentially the same is of this. That if you're not meeting the standards, you're not hitting the required levels and everything else, if you're being requested to attend the Rec Assurance Performance Board to explain things, then things have gone slightly awry and need to be addressed. Now, one of the things that they're also looking at, and it is worth pointing out at this point, there is a consolidation piece underway looking at the auditing function. So there is a consolidation piece and there will be a procurement activity looking at how auditing works and who's responsible for auditing and how it's going to work with a combined type audit. So that consolidation piece, there's a lot of work and effort gone into consolidating the whole thing into one big challenge. So if anybody hasn't seen the REC consolidation piece, it's underway currently. There is a part on the REC portal looking at that. It is worth going having a look at, just so you're familiar with it and you don't get blindsided with it at a later stage. So you've also got the metering expert panel. Now, one of the things that was extremely useful within the MAMCOP was the fact that all the GDNOs and meter or MEMS as they are now used to get together and have discussions. And that was useful from the point of ironing out issues and everything else. So that has been reintroduced under the REC. There is now a gas operational meeting and an electricity operational meeting held once a quarter. So I think the electricity is held 2 now and the gas is held 1, if I'm correct. They are worth attending. It's very useful if you want to express views or get things raised. So you speak to your rep who attends those or who has access to that, and they can table things in those and get things discussed. Now, before, when we looked at that, the original slides, we looked at Exaserve, we looked at Ofgem, we looked at all sorts of HSE and all sorts of other things. All those other areas sit outside the REC. So even though the REC may have input and they may have questions and they may have impacts and everything else, they are not under the direct control of the REC. These are for this, what we're talking about here, are the only things that they have direct control over. However, if there are impacts at other areas, there are cross-code working groups and access to those other groups so that those things can be highlighted and addressed and their impacts assessed. So it isn't as if anything's been lost, it's been streamlined to make it more cohesive. So it's just been worth bearing in mind that when we're talking about the REC and what the REC can govern, this is where the extra areas of responsibility with. That's not to say that they can't influence the other areas, it's just they don't have the direct control over it. Thanks, Amelia. Okay, so the last thing that I wanted to do on here and this whistle-stop tour was basically just explain where all those documents now sit. And for those that are people that have not ever navigated the REC portal or haven't got access to the REC portal, anybody can have access as long as you request it and you have the reason for having it. So the unfortunate thing being is all the documents that are on there are in a locked down area, so you can't just log in and see them. Whether you're supposed to or not, I don't know, because I tried it both ways. But basically, They are there for industry participants. So in effect, to get to where you need to be for these things, you do actually need to log on. So, excuse me, you'll see down the left hand side you've got the navigation portals, so the My Dashboard and everything else, and your party operations. If, for argument's sake, you try to get in without logging in, it'll actually throw you to the next screen, Amelia. So all you need to actually do is log in at that point, and then it'll take you back to the first screen I showed you. Now then, in here, so we talked about organisations that are AMIs, MEMS, and everything else. If you want to understand if a party you are dealing with or that yourself has the correct levels of authorizations, you can actually go into the area that's highlighted in black there, party operations. And if you click on the left hand button that says under applications, the next one down, party register, if you click that, excuse me, if you go on to the next one, Amelia, it will actually bring up an Excel spreadsheet, and at the bottom you can see the different tabs. Now the reason I haven't shown you what's on there just for GDPR purposes, because there are people's telephone numbers and addresses, and not addresses but telephone numbers and contact details on there, so if you've got access to it you are compliant under GDPR. But at the bottom you'll see a list of that says here's a list of all the acceded rec parties, so who's acceded to the rec, so who's actually allowed in there. Then you'll see the MCOP gas MEM accredited parties, and when we say gas MCOP MEMS, they are MEMS and AMIs in basically in one list. And then you see the next list is the approved meter installers. And then the next one is the MCOPA accredited parties. So if you ever need to see if an organisation has the correct accreditation and you're operating with them, you can actually see there. If you want to make sure that you've got the right levels of accreditation, again, it's in there. Any discussions or anything, you can go back through the Rec Code Manager to make sure that your details and everything. But it is worth, as organisations and people move around organisations, to regularly check that list to make sure you've got correct contact details and everything else, because somebody may be trying contacting your organisation for work and may not be able to get hold of you, or there may be an issue and need to get hold of somebody. So it is worth regularly checking the details in there and keeping those up to date. And you can see when I did this screen print, it is updated register, because it actually says that the register date on there was the 16th of the 9th. So it does actually keep a track as to how up to date it is. If you go on to the next one, Amelia, please. So again, going back to the front screen where we logged in, getting to the documents itself then. So before I move on to the documents itself, it's just worth being aware there is a knowledge and service desk icon on there. The knowledge base that's on there is really good. So it contains wikis, it contains podcasts and all sorts of things about the rec. And if anybody's never had a chance to have a look, it is worth a visit. If you've got questions and things like that, to go in there and have a look at those sort of things and increase your knowledge. However, for navigating to the documents and everything else that we've just been talking about, you want the bottom icon on the left hand side where it says digital rec and EMA. So if you click on that, and it'll take you to the next slide, Amelia, please. It takes you into the EMA repository, and in effect this is a list of where all the documents are held and what you need to be looking for. The ones, so there's, in the top section you'll see the governance documents on how the rec works and everything else. The next one down is where all the ones that we've been talking about are. So you can see the ASCOP in there, so for the AMR people. You can see the electricity MCOP, which used to be termed MCOPA, the gas MCOP, which we've just been discussing about, and then you've things like meter accreditation, metering operatives, metering operations in there. So the two documents that we've predominantly, or the three documents that we've been talking about, are actually the top one and the gas MCOP. So if you actually clicked onto the gas MCOP, I think it's the gas MCOP one I did. If you click on, there you go, thank you. It actually opens it up in an electronic format, and it is searchable. So it'll actually take you through how it works, what it's designed to do, and who's responsible for which parts. So when you actually go into the document, you can actually filter for, is it in relation to an AMI, is it in relation to a MEM? So you can see the relevant parts. You can download these things, just be aware that once it's downloaded, it's a non-controlled copy. So if any changes or anything are made to it, your copy may be out of date. So just be aware of that. You are potentially better working from a live version all the time. Excuse me. But that's where the relevant documents that you need for managing your business under gas, for the MCOP or the ASCOP, actually sit. And that was the last one, Amelia.
And we've got a question for you, Dave.
Do you know what? I was looking for this the other day because it was originally listed under the SPA. The RGMA document, I think it is in the EMA, and I think it is searchable, but I'm not sure. If I'm absolutely honest with you, I haven't located it. It might be one we need to take away and communicate out to people, Amelia.
Okay, yeah, I'll just flag that.
Yeah, but it was originally a SPA document, was that?
Okay, we'll flag that. Oh, and you're getting some praise as well, Dave.
Yeah, I've had to write my own, but thanks for that. That's why I had to put it in as anonymous. But whoever did that, thank you very much.
Thank you. Paul, is there any hands raised or anything that's come in on the chat?
No, there are no hands raised at the moment, Millie.
Okay,
I
perfect.
just wanted to say something as well, in addition to what Dave accurately said about accessing the documentation through EMAR on the rec portal. There is if you don't want to navigate through EMAR and access the sort of integrated digital versions of the documents like Dave has just demonstrated there, there's another way to do it. I'm just going to quickly share my screen to show you how. This is EMAR as Dave's just been demonstrating, but on the rec portal itself as well, there is a tab here that you don't need to sign into a rec portal account for, on the front page, called rec documents. And if you go through rec documents here, you can go down to see the current version of the rec, which you can download in PDF form, alongside all the schedules that exist under the rec as well, the operational documents such as the MCOP, the MCOP, the ASCOP, and things like that as well. So if you didn't want to go through the EMAR, or you didn't have an account, although as Dave said, it is simple to set up your own account, but if you didn't have an account or didn't want to create one, you can access the actual documents without having logged in through the front end of the portal here.
Thanks for that, Paul.
I'll just get back to sharing my screen and just see if there's any other questions come in. Right, sorry, I'm going to blame technology now for being slow. If it's going to work.
It's all right. It's matching my pace. I mean,
I think we've had no more questions come in. I'm just going to, and Paul, I'm going to guess nothing's come in. since
Nothing's
I
come in.
last
I just remember myself as well though. A question has just come in on Teams there from Gemma, and she's asked how you would know who your representatives are on the metering expert panel. Dave, I think I'll take this one because
Yep.
my role, by the way, I don't think I probably introduced myself, but Paul Rock, head of communications for the co-manager team, and part of that role encompasses committees as well. Once you are onto the portal, you can navigate to one of the items on the left-hand menu called committees. Again, this is something you'll need to create your account to go into, but it's nice and easy to do so. Once you're in that committees link, I'll share my screen again quickly so you can all see what I'm doing. Sorry, Melly. Once you're into this committees link here, you'll see this committee management page, and you won't see anything here if you're not in a member of a committee, but here you'll see a list of all the committees that exist. You can click onto the metering expert panel link here, and it will bring up the metering expert panel sort of dashboard. In here you can go into these useful documents and this meet the members tab here. This will load a PDF document which has information about who each of the members are, and you can contact us if you need to get in touch with them if you don't have their contact details, for example, but you can log in and see those details on there. They each have 2-year terms sitting on their committees. Those terms will expire in about a year's time, so in around 9 months we'll be starting the process for looking at the next term. These people may well stand again on these groups, but we'll be looking at how we run the process for nominations for the next years or the next terms, members and representatives to sit on those committees. I hope that answered the question. And I was just about to say as well, Millie, Dave had mentioned the metering code consolidation work that's ongoing at the moment, and the fact that there was a consultation that was live. I think I'm right in saying, Millie, that we've just on Friday launched another engagement event that's going to be taking place next week, that we encourage parties, if they are looking to respond to that consultation, to go along to be able to ask their questions and provide a more informed response to that consultation. Millie, do you want to run me what day next week that is?
It's on the 4th of October, and I'm just going to drop in actually the sign up for that just into the chat so people can actually have a look at that, and the agenda's on there and what will be discussed. But yeah, it's the 4th of October at 10, so let me just pop that into the chat for you.
And of course, just like today, we'll be recording that session and making the materials available, so even if you can't make it, and of course, just like all rec sessions, it's free to attend and it's virtual, like we make everything under the rec, but if you can't make it, we'll make sure we share that recording, and we'll get that out really promptly because we're aware that the consultation deadline is fast approaching. We want to maximize the time you've got to be able to consider all that information to help you make the most informed response.
Thanks, Paul. So that does conclude, let me just get my final slide up. That does conclude today's session. I don't think we've had any questions come in. We do, I think if you've attended a rec event before, you'll know that we do have, we ask for your feedback. So we do have a survey. So there's a poll on there, and there's an open text field as well. So, and we do take on your feedback. If there's anything that you didn't like or liked, then please do let us know, and we can obviously cater that for future events.
The other thing, Amelia, sorry, is if anybody thinks of a question afterwards, and the drop us a line, we'll post it out to everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. And as Paul and I mentioned before, this is the first of the 3 sessions. So in 2 weeks' time, we have the electricity session, and then on the 24th of October, we have the metering in the rec, which I think will kind of cover everything that's moved across and things like that. But as Dave said, happy for you to drop us a line if there's any questions as well that we can have, so we can obviously pop those into the slides in the presentation for the coming events. But I think that's it from us. So obviously, thank you for attending. We hope you found it useful, and please do let us know if there's any questions or you have any feedback for us. And we'll get this recording and these slides available on the portal and distribute those out as well. So yeah, thank you, and I hope you have a good rest of your Monday.